So, what is the best way to learn? I mean, is there an optimal process that you and I can use in order for us to learn better? And you know what? I think there is one. So, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Hey, how's everybody doing? And this is Melvin here with the Melvin Live Show. And it's great to have you here again. And today I just completed a 4 sessions with a group of key personnel. Well, they are from various organizations and they have come together to learn from me about strategic thinking. And to be honest with you, I felt that strategic thinking was something that I do, but to be able to teach it to someone else, I thought that was something that it's a little challenging. But nonetheless, I managed to get it out, and I was glad that I'm able to share with this group of people in terms of what exactly is strategic thinking. Now, in case you are not familiar with strategic thinking is a little different from strategic planning in the sense that when it comes to strategic thinking, the main idea behind that is that there is a way that we think, and the way that we think will allow us to look at how we will approach a certain context, a certain situation. So, say, for example, when you're faced with a situation like if, for example, you are a pharmaceutical company, and right now, when you're hit with this COVID-19 situation, how exactly are you going to respond to the situation itself? So that's the kind of things that you would need to do. And in order for you to be able to get out of the situation, what are some principles that you need to apply when it comes to strategic thinking, right? And so, if I could illustrate to you the idea of strategic thinking, actually, it's not too difficult to understand because primarily when you talk about strategic thinking, there are essentially 5 things that you want to look at. So here's the 5 things that I would like to share with you. All right, so the 5 things that you can look at when it comes to strategic thinking essentially is the following. So, right in the middle of it, we have strategic thinking. So, how do you think strategically, and what is the opposite of strategic thinking? So, the opposite of strategic thinking is to think in a very operational manner. In other words, you are not thinking in terms of how this whole thing is going to be able to impact your business and your operations, but you're just looking at how this thing is going to make an impact at the operational level. So we want to think at it as the strategic level because it is at the strategic level that we're able to leverage certain situations and to be able to think beyond what we call first order thinking in order to be able to come across as to compete effectively, for example. So that is in itself strategic thinking. But so there are 5 things, 5 elements, if you like, that look at strategic thinking. And the way that I approach strategic thinking is as follows. Number one, the first thing that I always ask myself is I want to look at this issue from a different perspective. So the first element is essentially systems perspective. In other words, what we're saying here is that this particular situation, are you only looking at it from one angle? Are you only looking at it from the perspective of the business? Are you also looking at perspective of the customer? Are you also looking at perspective of um, the investor, for example? So, when I was started out as a early stage .com CEO back in the year 2000, one of the key things that I learned very quickly was that in order to be a great CEO, one of the key things that you need to be able to see it from the different perspective. Now, something that you do for customers may be good for your business, but that may not be something that the investor is looking for, right? And something that you're doing just for the sake of satisfying investor may not be great for the customer. So ideally, it must all coincide at the center itself, because when you look at satisfying not just the investor and the customer, but also satisfying the business, the company, I think that is really, really crucial. So looking at system perspective, that's one aspect of it. Now, the second element that I would always look at is what is the intent, right? What is the intent? What is the focus? What is the end goal that I want in mind? So once we have able to listen out and hear the perspective from various different people, the next step really is to look at what is the end goal? How does that end goal look like? And what does that end goal mean to these different groups of people, right? And so it's not just talking about we want to be the number one in this industry itself, but what does that mean to customer? What does that mean to your employees? What does that mean to your investors? So the intent is, it's very, very crucial. And it's sometimes, oftentimes, when I speak to companies, when I speak to businesses and even schools, a lot of time people think that they have a clear idea of what the intent is, when in fact, what happened is they do not, right? So that is something that you really would want to be very, very clear about. Now, the third thing is really what they call thinking in time. And thinking in time essentially is looking at the situation from the perspective of a timeline. So right now you're here at this current situation. And what you want to do is you want to look at the past. But if all you do is just look at the past, then obviously that's not going to get you anywhere, because sometimes the past, what you have achieved in the past may not necessarily lead you to achieving the goals in the future. So when you look at the past, essentially what you're looking at is what is the mistakes that you made, right? What are your strengths? What are the mistakes you made? And what are some of the things that you need to pay attention to, for example, right? And then, of course, when looking forward, this is linked back to the intent itself, because when we are talking about intent, we're talking about the end goal. And with the end goal itself, we have a better idea of what we want to achieve. And here is really looking at what is the vision, what is the outcome that we want to create, right? And then at this moment is to say that based on all that, right, based on looking at what's coming up and based on what has been going on in the past, where does this fit us, right? What is it that is it that we want to continue? And then of course the next part really is to be able to come up with a set of hypotheses. And with this hypothesis itself is to say that, well, this is going to be our assumptions about how things are going to work. And if things are going to work in this particular manner, then these are the actions that I'll take, right? So this hypothesis essentially help you come up with the different strategies. And then, of course, at the end of it, you want to make sure that while you have a set of strategies that are firmly in place that everybody knows about, in addition to that, what you also would want to do is to be able to make adjustment according to what's happening in the outside world. So this is where they call the intelligent opportunism, right? So this, in a nutshell, are the 5 elements of strategic thinking. Now, when I read through the article that talked about this 5 element itself, one of the key questions that I had in mind was, yes, I do understand the principles, I do understand the concept, but the question is, how do I teach it, right? How do I teach it? And so I found a way to actually do this in a very, very efficient way and very effective way. And this method is what we call, deconstruct and then reconstruct. So the idea behind this is fairly, fairly simple. For example, if you want to, let's say if you want to make this product itself, right? One of the best ways to do is, of course, and the fastest way to do is to take this product, take it apart, and then put it back again. And essentially, that's what Henry Ford did, right? He bought an automobile and he took it apart and put it back. Took it apart, put it back on, took it apart, put it back on. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he did it he did it for a total of 50 times, 50, right? In order for him to be very, very familiar with how an automobile works. Now, so following that principle itself essentially is talking about how you can deconstruct something in order to be able to reconstruct it back, right? And so whenever I want to learn something new and I want to be able to teach it, the first thing what I would like to do is to deconstruct that. Now, what does deconstruct means? Basically, in a nutshell, in a very loosely literal term, deconstruct means taking it all apart. And when it comes to concepts like, say, strategic thinking itself, well, seriously, there are basically just one way to do this. And the way to do the deconstruct essentially is to look at the word strategic and thinking. So there are basically two parts here. One part strategic, one part is thinking. Now, let's talk about the thinking part first, right? Because the thinking part, I think, is the easier part. Now, the thinking part essentially is when we are faced with any situation itself, how exactly do we respond, right? How exactly do we respond to a certain thing? So, like Viktor Frankl says that, in between the stimulus and the response, there is a gap. And of course, the first time that we come across certain things, for instance, like when we first learn how to drive a car, every time when we come to a red light, that is a stimulus. How we respond is we have to be very deliberate and we have to be very focused. People call that conscious competence, that you have to say that, okay, I've got to step on the clutch and then put the gear into neutral before I press at the stop pedal, for example, right? That's the only way that I can stop the car without stalling, right? And so to do that, literally you have to kind of remind yourself, right? There is a huge gap here. You have to remind yourself that, oh, I have to do this, then I do that. And sometimes if you don't, or sometimes if you forget, what's going to happen is that your car is going to stall, which, for me, it has happened a lot of times. And so but over time, as you are doing it more and more and more, it becomes a subconscious competence. You can do it within about thinking, right? An example would be tying your shoelaces, right? I mean, right now, if I would have asked you to tie your shoelaces, you would have no problem doing that because it's already built into your muscle memory and you just know what to do, right? Even if I would have put you in a blindfold, for example, you would still be able to do that. So that's the subconscious competence. And so when you think about thinking, right, when you think about thinking, what exactly is the process that goes through your mind? And this is time where we want to peel back and say that, well, before I respond to the stimulus itself, actually, what is it that I'm thinking of? Right? What is the thing that I am thinking of? And that's very crucial because until and unless you are able to identify your thinking habits, thinking pattern, you might not be able to do something about it. So in my instance is when am faced with a particular situation, the first key question I would ask is, what does this mean? Right? What does this mean? And the response to that would lead me to a series of other emotions or other feelings or other actions. So when something happens, I would ask, what does this mean? Does this mean pain or does this mean pleasure? Right? So when I wake up and when I see that it's raining outside, for example, the first thing I'll ask myself is, what does that mean? Right? What does that mean? And until unless I'm able to say that, oh, right, that means that, I am going to have to get up early because if I do not and I slip in a little bit more, what's going to happen is that I'm going to go out later. And as a result of me going out later, what's going to happen is I'm going to be stuck in traffic and then I'm going to be late. Right? So So that kind of goes into the mind. And so whenever you're faced with any situation, how is it that you think? What are the questions that you're asking yourself? Essentially, that's the thing. So when you think about thinking, really, it's actually a series of questions that you ask yourself. Now, then let's come back to the other part of strategic, right? So what does it mean to be strategic? Well, one way of looking at strategic is leverage. Okay, leverage. Now, in other words, if you're looking at something that is strategic, it's what it means is that if I'm going to put in 20% of my effort, this thing is going to give me 80% of the results. And that's essentially what we want to look at, right? I mean, you do not want to put 80% of your effort into only delivering 20% of the results. Like, for example, do you want to spend 80% of the time trading time for money and only make so much? Or do you want to be able to spend 20% of the time leveraging technology to be able to build a one person, 1 million business, all things digital, and allows that to supplement or allow that to generate 80% of your income? Well, you take your pick, right? And so when it comes to strategic, essentially it's what is the leverage? But if you were to break down leverage even further, and this is where the five elements come into play, because when you think about leverage, what exactly does leverage means? Right? Literal sense, we all know what leverage means. But what are the things that will allow us to be able to see things that the that sometimes people may look but they do not see? And that's a very crucial question, because once we are able to figure that out, then obviously we will be able to think in a more strategic manner than other people. And of course, strategic here in this sense here is looking at these five elements. And once you get a sense of these five elements itself, and you kind of understand what a strategic thinking means, now the next step is for you to reconstruct. And when I think about reconstructing, the best way to do that is what I've learned in economics 101, right? What I learned in economics 101 is whenever we come to the new topic, there are a few things that we always talk about. One is, what are the assumptions? And we used to make fun of the word assumption, assumption, make an ass out of you and me. But over time, I come to recognize the merit and the beauty of having assumptions. Now, what does assumption means? Assumption means that you have a certain way of thinking and you hold certain thing constant. So there are two parts here. One is the way that you believe how things work, right? How things work. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is that, what is it that you can keep under control? Right? What is it that you can keep under control? And so when you think about assumptions itself, what are the assumptions about how things work? So let's say if I want to think about how can I think strategically in a situation like now, right? Now where people are moving everything online, or arguably moving a lot of their activities online, what is it that I know, and what are some of the assumptions that I have? What are some of the ways that things are going to work? Those becomes my belief, those becomes my assumption, those are what I believe to be how things work. And once I'm able to figure out how things work, the next part is, can I then relax some of these assumptions? And so what do we mean by relax certain assumptions? For instance, right now we may think that, well, everybody have a computer, or everybody have access to a mobile device that allows them to live stream, right? That may become an assumption. Well, and so if that assumption, if that is a belief that we have, then of course we would say that, well, then obviously everyone and anyone can do live streaming. However, is that true? Obviously not, because some people may not have the device, or some people may have the device but not the availability of data, for example, right? And so that leads to another different set of issue. And with that itself, we kind of have a better idea of what is it that we can do and what is it that we can't do. So once we have found out that, okay, I know that people have access to device, but they do not have access to data, then probably live streaming might not be it, but probably doing a recorded video might be the thing that they could do, right? And so that kind of helps you think about things in a strategic way, and that helps you to be able to look at things from that perspective itself. All right. And so in that sense, that's really where you are able to deconstruct, right? You are able to break things down. You're able to say that, hey, let's take this apart and let's look at it from, the angle of what if, right? What if this thing, um, um, what if we take this apart? What does it mean? And then later on, we put it together. And as we put it back together, one of the key things that we definitely want to do is to be able to think about, holding on to some assumptions and knowing what we can control and what we cannot control. Right? And so this is the show for us today. I hope you learned something once again. And tell me how you learn. I mean, what is the process that you go through in terms of learning? Because that is really, really interesting to me. I would like to know, and I would like to be able to help you see if there is a better way for you to learn. Because I firmly believe that the reason why we as adults learn, right? Just like Malcolm knows what he says, the reason why we learn is not because we are driven by the content of what we learn and why we learn. It's because we are driven by the problem. What that means is that you learn because you have a problem that you want to have it solved, and as long as that problem is not solved, what you have to do is to keep on learning. And so, in a nutshell, if you are looking at achieving a goal, but right now, at this point in time, you are not there yet, and you need to take a series of actions to be able to reach that goal, it might mean that you have to do something very different. And if you're going to do something very different, you may not have the skill set, the mindset, or even the tool set. And so, this is the time for you to learn, to apply, to experiment, and that's how you are going to be able to get to your goal. Right? I hope this has been helpful. As always, let me know whether you have questions for me, what you felt was useful, what was not useful. I'd like to know that. And with that, I thank you so much for watching. Once again, this is a Melvin live show. I'll talk to you on the next one. Bye bye.